Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host with another marvelous video. Superman's near-century-long existence wouldn't have been possible if he didn't have such a vast and deep roster of villains to keep going up against. Don't get us wrong, we actually quite like the alien discovering their humanity origin story, and Kal-El's internal struggles have manifested into some rather iconic external ones. But what happens when instead of defeating his enemies like he always does, Superman ends up, becoming them? This is an idea that has been explored extensively within the context of villains like Lex Luthor and Darkseid, but this 2014 storyline managed to highlight not one but two of Superman's iconic enemies who are yet to receive a live-action adaptation that does them justice: Brainiac and Doomsday. Co-written by Greg Pak, Charles Soule, and Scott Lobdell, Superman Doomed was a crossover Superman story arc that saw the Man of Steel contend with the monstrous entity that killed him back in the 90s, whilst obviously dancing on the strings of the Coluan who shrank Kandor. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into this. This is Super-Brainiac-Doom's origins explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. A world divided and a debt unpaid. Events that led up to Superman Doomed Issue 1. Before we dive into the events of the actual Superman Doomed issues, we believe a bit of context is essential because, as we mentioned in our intro, this is a crossover story arc that involved at least 4 other titles. The escape that led to Superman Doomed Issue number 1 was set up in Action Comics Volume 2, Issue number 30, expanded upon in Superman Wonder Woman, and established in Superman Volume 3, Issue 30. Because the New 52 was essentially a reboot of the entire DC continuity, which, spoiler, didn't last long, a lot of classic Superman dynamics have been changed here, but we need to only focus on 2 of them. 1. Jonathan and Martha Kent are dead in this continuity, meaning Clark struggles with keeping his humanity far more than he did before. In particular, he finds himself not being able to count to 10 and calm the heck down as frequently as he used to. The second change is that Superman's love interest isn't Lois Lane, it's Wonder Woman. The two superpowered individuals sparked a romance that had been head-canonized for decades. In issue number 12 of Justice League Volume 2, when their too strong to be with humans connection was a tad less platonic than it used to be earlier. Lois Lane is in the story, don't get us wrong, but she's more Clark Kent's journalistic rival and Senator Lane's daughter than a love-struck Superman worshipper, and she's going to be proving that statement later on in the video. But now that you have some important context for the world the New 52 version of Superman was living in, let's give you the setup for Superman Doomed. And yes, we'll be going in chronological order across those 3 issues we mentioned earlier. Superman is flying Ghost Soldier from Venezuela to the Alps, where the HQ of the mysterious organization known as the Tower is located. For those of you who don't know, they're the same guys who were behind the Baca incident in Venezuela, and the Ghost Soldier is exactly what he sounds like, a meta who can exist in the physical and metaphysical planes. Kal-El heeds his dad's advice when he's ticked off, and counting down to 10 usually helps, but this time he's up to 1,000 and he was still angry. After reaching the HQ, he cuts loose on the ghost soldiers that Tower leader Harrow sent after him. These are literal ghost soldiers, not to be confused with the ghost soldier Leonard Sawyer himself. He blasts his way into the Tower HQ and confronts Harrow, but is verbally put down for being more of a threat to Earth than its guardian angel. Superman and Wonder Woman did set off a nuclear explosion when General Zod invaded Earth after all, and Kal's immense power made him a target by himself. It turns out Lex Luthor wasn't alone in his boycotting of the Kryptonian, and Kal-El nearly proved his critics right. Superman struggled to reconcile his anger with his mission as Harrow unleashed legions of dead soldiers onto him, their attacks making him feel their rage and anger. Clark contains his emotions and manages to turn the spirits on the person who summoned them, beating Harrow at her own game. But when she asks him to finish the job, he relents. Because what is he if Superman just starts killing people whilst calling himself a symbol of hope? But Harrow mocks him for his mercy and tells him he'll join her army eventually, before departing. Clark and Diana catch up for some much-needed couples time, and while Clark is still doubtful of the changes that have been taking place in his own mindset lately, being with her reassures him of his own goodness. They spend some time dancing at Diana's favourite club in London, whose proprietor tells Clark he must be a lucky guy for her to even bring him there. And then Superman makes his way to Smallville, where something odd has happened. Somehow, every resident of Superman's hometown has fallen into a deep coma simultaneously. baffling every person who heard of the situation, including Soups himself. He's confronted by the Eradicator upon his arrival, who leaves him with an ominous message. An Eradicator's appearance means death for the world that any Kryptonians are residing upon. So he's here to warn Superman that Earth's death was imminent. Only it wouldn't be a natural one. She would be murdered by none other than Superman. He casts Kal-El into space and vanishes, leaving him to wonder what his warning could have meant when he finds the answer in the Bahamas. Across all three of these issues, the Tower organization has somehow freed the only entity that has actually managed to kill Superman, Doomsday. The beast appears first in the Arctic Circle, slaughtering polar bears like they were sheaves of paper, with Tower operatives observing his every movement. Doomsday comes across a couple of civilians, and it's expected that a beast so ravenous would just slaughter them instantly as well. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he breaks the iceberg they were standing upon and flees into the depths of the sea, with Tower operatives noting that he was somehow evolving. And worse yet, Doomsday was planning something of his own accord. They re-establish contact with the entity in the Mariana Trench, where Doomsday is giving the same treatment he dished out on those polar bears to some helpless sharks and squids. But as soon as he detects the Tower submarine, he destroys it, and we see what they meant when they said he was different. Somehow, Doomsday had evolved into an even more monstrous beast, whose very presence seemed to incinerate all life around him, as evidenced by the couple he sent packing to heaven perfectly boiled. This is where our story begins, with Superman asking Cyborg to update him of any movement made by Doomsday, and an island in the Bahamas being decimated to death. Honeymoon Island is ground zero for the horror of the Doomsday virus. Superman Doomed Issue Number 1. As soon as Doomsday appeared at Honeymoon Island, the US scrambled 3 jets with a significant payload to contain the threat. But when the pilots arrived at the scene, all they found was a damn slaughterhouse. Doomsday had, without moving from his position, managed to kill every resident on the island. Everyone within 100 yards of him spontaneously combusted, and even the buildings in his vicinity were damaged on a molecular level. Just think about that, and what must have been going through those pilots' brains witnessing this madness. One of them rightfully called out to God when Doomsday noticed the jets, but it was Superman who answered the call and saved all of them from a crispy fate. 3 people against the 3,220 who once called the island home. Clark's disappointment and anger are understandable and palpable. He flies back to the island to confront the monster who once took his life, but all he can see and hear is the carnage of his failure. Doomsday has vanished from ground zero of an epidemic that, if not contained within time, would have turned the world into, well, him. See, back at the Fortress of Solitude, Dr. Shea Veritas, the leading scientist in the world, tells Superman that this Doomsday is nothing like the Doomsday that killed him. If anything, that guy was a lava. This version of the Kryptonian Grim Reaper has reached near full maturity of whatever the heck it's supposed to be, and far outclasses anything Superman has faced before. Kal-El darkly asks Shea whether Doomsday is sentient or not, and whether he can kill it, something he's clearly reluctant to do, but is realizing he might be forced to anyway. Shea deduces that Superman has already made his decision with regards to what approach he's going to take with Doomsday if push comes to shove, and can sense his hesitation as well. But she tells him it isn't a question of him wanting to kill Doomsday. Superman is the only thing on Earth that can fight at close quarters for 10 minutes without turning into ashes. So the real question is what happens if Superman doesn't kill Doomsday. The scene shifts to Smallville, where Clark Kent's childhood friend and current electrical engineering whiz Lena Lang is trying to gain entry to her hometown. The whole place had been placed under quarantine after all of its residents fell into a mysterious coma, and Lena was determined to ensure her parents' survival, even if it warranted force. She tries to trick her way past the security personnel guarding the path into Smallville, lamenting that Clark wouldn't approve of this. But before she can say what he doesn't know wouldn't hurt him, another path opens up for her in the form of Lois Lane. Daily Planet star reporter and the daughter of a senator besides, Lois has no problem gaining entry into Smallville, and Lena decides to hitch a ride without letting her ride know she was actually there. It doesn't work, and Lois invites her inside, talking to her about Clark for a minute before asking her to suit up and see what was really up in Smallville. But there was something odd about her. When Lena asked her how she'd managed to sweet-talk her way into gaining entry, she told her it was Jedi mind tricks. Keep that in mind because it'll be important later. The scene briefly shifts to Metropolis, where Clark has returned to the Daily Planet after quitting, looking for some advice from his former editor-in-chief. He uses the context of an important but potentially hurtful news story to ask him how he should take care of Doomsday without feeling guilt or remorse over the fact that he killed someone. Mr. White doesn't really know why Superman is asking him this question in his civilian identity, but his answer does clear the doubts from the Man of Steel's mind. He tells Clark that rock-solid principles can often be shattered in the business of journalism, and compromises, as unfortunate as they can be, were a part of the game. But the fact that he was even questioning that tells him that Clark's intentions with the story are pure. he tells him that he was a good kid when he joined the Daily Planet, and he's grown into a good man. So he should run that story because, in the Chief's opinion, Clark would turn out just fine on the other side of the line. This reassures Superman's faith in his own mission, and Clark even agrees to discuss his return to the planet with his chief. But little does he know he's about to lose the very essence that makes him what he is. We go back to Smallville, where Lena Lang is distraught over her parents' condition and is texting Clark to come back despite knowing how busy he must be. Clark apologizes profusely for not being able to come to her aid and asks her to hold the fort down when we cut to Lois Lane, saying something odd. She accounts for the number of brains of the comatose Smallville residents and then prepares to start a neural bore. And by this point, you guys must have figured it out, but we'll break it down for you anyway. Toward the closing stages of Superman Volume Number 3, Issue Number 30, Lois Lane begins behaving oddly, and it's revealed that this is because she's been brainwashed into becoming the bride of the Collector of Worlds, aka Brainiac's latest incarnation, whose mothership looks just like the Nowhere skull on cybernetic Cthulhu steroids. Brainiac appears to be harvesting the brains of the residents of Smallville for some nefarious purpose, which we'll talk about later in the video. But for now, you just have to remember that both the coma incident and the appearance of Doomsday took place within a short span of one another. And as you must realize now, that wasn't a coincidence. As Lois confirms to her master that the humans have no idea about their scheme, the scene shifts to a jungle in Botswana, where a research team has the utter misfortune of meeting Doomsday during their ecological studies. John Henry Irons, who is spending some family time with his niece in Zambia, notices the explosion that the last encounter causes, and Steel immediately springs into action, but to no avail. One blow from Doomsday leaves Steel near death, and there's no telling if he'd have even survived if Wonder Woman hadn't arrived to settle a score with the monster. Henry warns Diana not to approach it directly, given what had just happened to him, but the Goddess of War is undeterred. She charges at Doomsday with a head-on assault and manages to impale him with her sword, but his body discharges a weird toxin that is slowing her movements and also possibly killing him. As the two juggernauts tangle with each other and Doomsday gains on the weakened Wonder Woman, Superman arrives on the scene and blasts him away with his heat vision. He's shocked by how big Doomsday has become and pleads with Diana to escape as he takes care of the situation, but she convinces him to join her in a combined attack. Her warrior cry manages to halt Doomsday in its tracks, and they charge their attacks for the climactic finish, but the creature escapes once again by opening up a portal to the Phantom Zone. Wonder Woman is relieved by the retreat, but Superman knows better. Doomsday didn't accept defeat, it just went back into the shadows to prepare for its next attack, and Steel concludes that it won't stop until everything is dead. Back at the Justice League's HQ, the group is accounting for the collateral damage. Doomsday's little rampage in Africa managed to turn Wildebeest into an endangered species. Such was the scale of his sheer presence. As the group were about to come up with a strategy to deal with him, a holographic Lex Luthor showed up out of nowhere. He told the League that Doomsday wasn't actually killing the animals he's been laying the smackdown on so far. He was actually absorbing their life essence to surpass Superman in strength. Luthor also points out that since Superman is Doomsday's target, the only way to keep Earth safe would be for Kal-El to leave it. To everyone's dismay, Superman actually agrees with his archenemy and states that he wants to leave the planet altogether, but he wasn't going to do it alone. After handing Batman a key to the Fortress of Solitude, the Man of Steel sets out to kill the entity that managed to erase his existence at one point in time. With Wonder Woman asking him to bring her Doomsday's head, Superman strengthens his own resolve and he tracks down his fatal foe to the coastal city of Mumbai. But he was too late once again. Doomsday had devastated the densely populated Indian city and was about to kill a family when Superman swooped in and used his sonic clap to drive the creature back. He promised the little boy behind him that he would protect him no matter what, and punched Doomsday so hard he propelled him into space. Kal-El kept pounding on his enemy's rocky hide until they literally reached the planet Venus, all the while recalling the many promises he'd made along the way. The anger and rage he'd been bottling up so far came in handy for once, as after a savage interplanetary battle, he was able to light up Doomsday with a concentrated blast from his heat vision, but that would prove to be an effort in vain. Superman arrived back at Smallville to help his childhood friend Lena with her parental problems after the fight, but Doomsday once again teleported to his location, looking to finish the job once and for all. The Man of Steel yelled at every bystander to run away as far as they could from it, knowing well what would happen to them if they didn't, and prepared to make his final stand in his hometown. The last time they fought like this, Doomsday managed to kill him in front of the Daily Planet building. This time, it looked more of the same, but in Clark's hometown, adding insult to injury. But somewhat scarily, that wasn't the case. Doomsday's pummeling only drove Kal-El deeper into the recesses of his rage, and when it finally boiled over, he snapped and tore Doomsday in half. And no, we're not being metaphorical there. As he inhales the black mist that had been pouring out of Doomsday all this while into his own lungs using his suction breath, Superman hits the ground saying, "I promised." The last image of Superman, doomed issue number 1, is of the Man of Steel lying unconscious in a crater, unaware of just how fundamentally he himself was about to change. A very, very, very short summary of what happens between Superman Doomed issues number 1 and 2. Okay, so we're going to be condensing a lot of information into this section of our video, simply because it's important to you understanding just how Superman ended up becoming a combination of his worst enemies, even if it was for a brief period of time. The story of Superman's second near-fatal encounter with Doomsday continues in Action Comics Volume 2, issues 31 to 34, Superman Wonder Woman issues numbers 8 to 11, Superman Batman issue number 11, the Superman Wonder Woman Annual Issue number 1, the Action Comics Annual Issue number 3, and even has enough time to make a pit stop at Supergirl Volume 6, Issue number 34, before coming full circle. As you can see, that's a lot of ground to cover, so bear with us and feel free to fill in the gaps in the comments section below. After inhaling all of Doomsday's death mist, Superman falls unconscious and has a dream where he appears to find himself as a fiery mixture of a Kryptonian and Doomsday. As he thinks to himself that he's Superman and he'll save the world, his thoughts are warped by an instant desire to kill, which jars Clark back into reality. He reassures himself that he wasn't the one who killed all those people. It was Doomsday, but that dream would prove more ominous than he could have known at the time. Lena Lang and Lois Lane were in Smallville when Doomsday arrived for another pound of flesh. But it was Wonder Woman who made it to Superman's side first. She carried Clark off with her and was trying to reassure him that he would be okay, but even Diana knew something was wrong. For one thing, she could sense her lover's rage and the thin veil with which he was holding it back. For another, she might have sensed Clark's momentary fantasy of brutally murdering Lex Luthor because the president of LexCorp had been commissioned by the government to detain Superman as a threat. Diana knows Clark doesn't trust Lex one bit and puts her faith in the fact that he knows what he's doing when Superman takes off for Alaska, leaving the rest of the League in his wake, but it soon becomes clear that he doesn't. When Batman calls in to check on Superman, Clark tells him that something's off, and Bruce immediately gets on the case. He collects a blood sample from the site of the fight and blows up the rest of the evidence to go see just what was up with the Man of Steel, but the Fortress of Solitude provides the answer. Clark thought that by spending some time with Krypto and soaking the Alaskan sun, he'd be back to normal, but when he ripped apart a poaching party's helicopter out of blind rage, he realized he liked reveling in his anger, and that alone should be scary enough for all of us, because when he returned to the fortress with his super dog, Kal-El found that he could no longer enter his Dome of Solitude, because while it accepted his voice code, it rejected his DNA code. He looked at his hands and saw the same bony protrusions coming out of it that made Doomsday's character so iconic, and Batman's worst suspicions are confirmed. Superman's DNA was now identical to Doomsday's, which meant that he was now a threat. Apparently, the death mist that Doomsday was emitting was actually a type of viral spore that, if inhaled, would turn its subject into Doomsday himself. This Doomsday virus must have been a byproduct of the creature's evolution, and it changed Superman on more than a physical level. He became more angry, vicious, and unrelenting. He started avoiding work and questioned Wonder Woman's loyalty. Clark had told her he loved her, but she never said it back. She would always be the first to help him out, but he would always be the last to know of her troubles. Batman and Wonder Woman were able to stop him from succumbing to the virus entirely by telling him to use his willpower to slow it down. It worked for a while, and Superman might have even been able to find a cure for himself had he been left alone. Alas, Lex Luthor is a man who doesn't take an L in silence. See, Superman had turned himself over to the authorities after he realized what he was becoming, or what he'd already become, and no one was happier about this than the Lex Express. But then a Brainiac-controlled Lois Lane caused Superman to break loose, and that was enough for the public to lose all trust in him. They already knew that he was turning into a second Doomsday. Now they had to worry about him really turning into one. The government authorized Superman's death, and Lex commandeered the resources of Steel to accomplish that exact task, but in the scuffle that followed, a blanket of kryptonite mist melded with the Earth's atmosphere and weakened Kal-El internally, leaving only Doom in its wake. The entity known as Super Doom has only one thing on its mind, and that is destruction. Had Wonder Woman not dragged Clark out of the Earth's orbit with her lasso of truth, who knows what untold horrors he might have unleashed on the planet as the strongest being in the galaxy. The two lovers part ways in somber fashion, with Clark accepting his fate and warning Diana of Lois's possession. Flying through space, he almost became hopeful that he might go back to normal someday after smashing a bunch of asteroids, but those hopes were dashed after going on a mission with the Red Lanterns where Clark gave in to the Doomsday virus and used Super Doom's mindless destructive power to beat a planet-consuming entity known as Hakar. anymore. Even as he helps his friends Lena and Steel defeat the cyborg Superman's army, which was preparing to invade Earth, it's clear to the former two that Superman is not the being they once knew. Watching his rampage through the unmanned ships of cyborg Superman's army, John prays that the man they are watching is indeed Superman still. But that might be a bit of a stretch considering the utter contempt he displays at cyborg Superman, claiming the symbol of the House of El. Meanwhile, on Earth, Brainiac has revealed himself as the mastermind of everything that's happened so far. He manipulated Tau and entities from the Phantom Zone to engineer Doomsday's escape, and then used the infected Lois Lane to start assimilating the brains of every person on Earth to create a psionic weapon of untold proportions. It starts with Smallville, and then spreads outwards, hitting Metropolis next, with the eventual idea being putting the entire world in a coma. Even though Martian Manhunter was able to help Superman gain better control of his splitting psyche, and he was able to free Lois of Brainiac's mind control, things had gotten to a point beyond his help. The mothership was descending on Earth, and if Brainiac's plan succeeded, humans would end up dying anyway, starting with those living in Smallville and Metropolis. Superman heads into space alone to confront the Collector of Worlds by himself, and wonders if he must unleash the Doomsday virus to its entire virility to save his world. We've missed out a lot of details there, trust us, but this is all you need to know before we dive into Superman Doomed issue number 2. Having said that, a man's struggle with his inner demons and the godlike Super-Brainiac-Doom, Superman Doomed issue number 2. The story opens with Lena Lang suffering the worst loss a child can ever imagine witnessing, her parents. Their brains were being collected by Brainiac as they started having a heart attack, signaling that the final stage of the Collector of Worlds plan was in motion. Batman grimly notes that Smallville residents will be first, followed by Metropolis, then Gotham, New York, and eventually the rest of the world. A distraught Lena turns to Martian Hunter and Lois Lane, who's managed to retain her telepathic powers from Brainiac despite being freed from his grasp, and asks them where the hell Superman was. John notes that he'd broken through the Earth's atmosphere, but questions whether they could call him Superman anymore, as we see the result of Clark's dilemma. He had decided to give himself over to the Doomsday virus and was tearing a burning path towards Brainiac's mothership. Lois tries to reach Superman telepathically, but is forcefully repelled by the vortex of rage swirling in his mind. Martian Manhunter notes that Doomsday only exists to kill, which is the exact opposite end of the spectrum Superman finds himself on after starting this story, worrying about whether the killing was the right thing to do in the first place. Lois and Martian Manhunter give another shot at trying to contact Clark within Super Doom's mind, using their powers in conjunction with the fact that Lena Lang, his childhood friend, would be able to appeal to his humanity no matter what. Lois connects with the part of Super Doom's consciousness that still remembers Clark Kent and patches Lena through, and the two of them remind him why he's doing what he's doing. They remind him of Kara, Krypto, Barker, Jimmy Olsen, and Perry White, and the rest of the 7 billion people of Earth who look up to him as their savior. Martian Manhunter uploads a map of Brainiac's mothership into Clark's brain, and it seems like Lois is about to make an emotional appeal to Clark for his return, when Lena jumps in to remind him that her parents are dying and to not waste time and kill Brainiac immediately. As Super Doom starts smashing his way through the mothership, Perry White suddenly calls for Clark Kent deep within his mind. The editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet notes that he had to dig through his entire mind to get to him, but he did seem pretty dead now that he was here. White touches Clark's chest and revives him, pleading with him to stop Doomsday's rampage as it could inadvertently end up killing the very people he was trying to save. But Superman's eyes see through more than walls. He deduces that this was in fact Brainiac, and Vril Dox finally reveals himself within Clark Kent's subconscious. To give you guys an idea of what just happened, Brainiac pulled the same move that Thor does in his first fight with Kratos in God of War Ragnarok. Superman was practically brain dead when Brainiac found him, and without his little recharge, it's hard to tell if anything Lois and Lena said to him would have ever even reached him. Turns out, the only reason Brainiac revived him was to give him his big villain speech. Vril Dox explains to Kal-El that the universe exists because we perceive it existing. So, if he collected the psionic energies of enough sentient beings, he could literally reimagine the universe as it was. He says he wasn't lying about the part where Clark would end up killing billions if he kept pursuing him, because at this moment, Brainiac was linked to every consciousness on his ship and Earth. It didn't give him enough power to reimagine the universe yet, but it certainly made killing him a problem, and left him with enough power to probe through Superman's mind and see what was really making him rampage through his ship. He realizes that he's deeply concerned about Lena, so he shows Superman a vision of a peaceful future where Lena marries Steel, and they become the guardians of a metropolis so safe Superman isn't even needed anymore. Clark wipes away the illusion with a swipe of his hand and insists that the world Brainiac is offering to him is not real. Vril Dox continues with his spiel of making the universe better together, trying to halt Super-Doom's progress by any means necessary. But when Clark reveals that Lena told him to kill Brainiac, the Coluan turns the tables on him. Steel and Lena start getting assimilated by the Collector as Clark is still trapped within the mental prison. And just then, Cyborg Superman attacks the Fortress of Solitude. He begins tearing the place apart and mocks Batman for using smoke bombs against someone who can withstand supernovas when Supergirl flies in to engage the Cyber Kryptonian. Lois pleads with Clark to continue what he was doing and leave the rest to them, as Cyborg Superman tries to convince Kara to join Brainiac's side. He tries to tempt her with the promise of returning to their real home, Krypton, when Kara tells him to shut the hell up and helps him on his way by punching his face in. Brainiac acknowledges to Superman that his cousin is strong and might just beat Cyborg Superman after he was put through the ringer by Super-Doom, but he suspects that Kal-El wouldn't want that. Superman calls Brainiac out for being scared, and the Coluan only tells him that he should be as well. The only logical way to save the people he loves is to surrender to him. That's how Superman can achieve the peace and reconciliation he dreams of deep down. But Clark rejects his proposal and asks him how he can trust anyone who was killed and destroyed so much. Brainiac concedes that he hasn't given him much of a reason to trust him, but he shows Kal-El what would happen if he dies. He shows him the outcome he thinks is most likely to take place in the battle between Supergirl and Cyborg Superman. Kara will manage to not only defeat, but kill the enhanced Kryptonian, but Brainiac drops a bombshell about the latter's identity. Turns out, Cyborg Superman was Zor-El, Kal-El's uncle, and a man who was stuck in the Phantom Zone, just like Doomsday. Kal-El is shocked by this revelation, but there's more. Brainiac uses the prophecy of the last night of the House of El to show him a vision of Supergirl killing him in his Super-Doom form, but in the aftermath, getting infected herself. Superman would just perpetuate the cycle of the Doomsday virus, so wouldn't it be better if he just gave up? But this makes Clark laugh because he confirms at that moment that Brainiac knew nothing about him or his family. Kara would never kill her opponents, which is proven true when she knocks out Cyborg Superman and brings him to Lois so they can break him free of Brainiac's mind control. Superman taunts him by saying he doesn't understand them, and when Brainiac realizes that he can't use Zor-El or Supergirl any further, he just decides to assimilate them instead. Brainiac gives Superman a final vision of the world that Superman dreams of building with his friend Batman, and we see Clark flying down to a balcony where Bruce is waiting for him with a glass of champagne in his hand. It's a celebration commemorating 25 years since Batman's retirement. Bruce tells Clark that it worked in the end, as mad as it seems. He was always the skeptical type and didn't put much stock in stuff like hope. Bruce preferred numbers and things he could beat into a pulp with his bare hands. He knew that the world would never be perfect, but if only 10% of it changed, it would be much better off than it had ever been. And the miracle had somehow happened. The example of Superman had actually changed the world. Bruce said, "You gave me my life back, Blue." Clark nearly bought the charade, but it fell through when Brainiac didn't even know who Diana was. He tried to promise him everything he and Batman ever wanted to build, without knowing that is not how the Trinity does. But Brainiac said he had what he wanted, as he started assimilating Batman's brain as well. With that, the process was seemingly complete as Vril Dox felt reality itself changing around him. But Superman had his doubts. If he couldn't find Diana, that meant the game wasn't over yet, and his premonition turned out to be correct when Wonder Woman showed up with Mongul and Non tied to her lasso of truth, Warworld in tow. She made Mongul blast the mothership with Warworld twice, and that broke down Brainiac's internal defenses enough to allow Super-Doom to reach the core. He unhooks Brainiac from the core, and Lois Lane stops assimilating with her former master, becoming completely free of his grasp instead, when Clark pulls her into their shared psionic space and introduces her to a man named Vril Dox. We learn that Brainiac was a scientist on his home planet and was married with a child, but he ended up experimenting on his son in an effort to develop technology that could save his planet. He failed at the time and was only able to bottle up the remnants of the home he lost. Since then, everything he's done has been about getting his family back, and Superman tries to tell Lois that they should, once again, be merciful. Lois loses it in his face, and actually ends up agreeing with Lena Lang for once, reminding Clark how Brainiac enslaved billions, including her. Clark says it isn't fair, yes, but in the end, what do they want? Punishment or peace? That much was enough to sway Lois to his thinking, but Vril Dox was having none of it. He tore through the apparitions of his family and started directly assimilating Lois's brain, realizing it would be enough to make his life whole anyway. Rapidly losing her life force, Lois asks Superman if he's prepared to do what it takes to defeat Brainiac. And when he says yes, she touches his mind and transfers her powers combined with Brainiac's into Soup's instead. We finally get a proper glimpse of Super-Brainiac-Doom in all his glory. Imagine Doomsday in a Superman costume with glowing purple dots on his body and green rocky skin. That's an accurate description of this entity that, for a brief moment, was both the strongest and the smartest entity in the universe. Doomsday, before evolving, was strong enough to beat Superman, and Super Doom was a combination of both of them. Throw in Brainiac's billions of assimilated brains that allowed him to reimagine reality, and you have an entity that is on par with beings like Perpetua in theory. In practice, it only spells one person's doom, and that is Vril Dox's. Using his newfound powers, Super-Brainiac-Doom manages to crack open Vril Dox's mothership so hard that it creates a literal black hole. He releases the consciousness of the billions Dox had assimilated over the years, giving them their lives back or putting them to rest, and he prepares to put things right one last time, only the way Superman can. Super-Brainiac-Doom flies into the black hole with Vril Dox in tow, as the latter calls him crazy for not using his powers to at least save himself. Superman muses that might be true, but right now, his priority is saving them, as we see the people of Earth waking up and Brainiac entering a multiverse-esque space. Though his appearance was restricted to a few panels, Super-Brainiac-Doom depicted Kal-El Clark Kent at his highest and lowest points simultaneously. On one hand, he was the zenith of physical and psionic strength, but on the other hand, he was forced to make a lot of fatal compromises to get there. Superman Doomed, in general, is a storyline that exposes the human heart that lies at the core of an alien who is constantly struggling to be completely accepted, and navigating that complexity with his arch-enemies ending up in his own DNA was a great method for exploring that. Marvelous verdict. For those of you wondering what happened to Superman after all that he went through, well, it's rather anticlimactic. Turns out, it took him about 2 months of flying through space to return to Earth, and the only side effects of his harrowing ordeal were a beard and more than slight fatigue. The in-universe explanation at the time for him losing the Doomsday virus was, "Black holes will suck that stuff out of you, we guess." And that's the most cop-out comic book story conclusion ever. But at least the action that took us on this journey was exhilarating from start to finish. Keeping up with Superman Doomed can be a pain at times, just because of the sheer number of tie-in issues that you have to get through to get to its conclusion. But in our opinion, it's worth it. Super-Brainiac-Doom was genuinely one of the most terrifying forms of Superman we've seen across his near-century-long existence. And communist Superman is a thing. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.